Robert Francis Kennedy, who was born on November 20th, 1925 in Brookline, Massachusetts, had 5 sisters and 3 brothers. Bobby Kennedy went to Harvard University, but in the middle of his college career, World War II started, and Robert decided to join the Army to serve for his country. After the war was over, Robert returned to Harvard, played college football, then graduated. On June 6, 1966, Robert Kennedy made a speech in Cape Town, South Africa, called The Ripple of Hope. Here's a sample of the speech.
It is from numberless, diverse acts of courage such as these that the belief that human history is thus shaped. Each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance.
On March 16, 1968, Robert Kennedy announced his intentions to run for the Democratic presidential nomination in the caucus room of the old Senate office building, which is the same place that his late brother declared his candidacy for president 8 years earlier.
This is a picture of John F. Kennedy. He was the President of the United States from 1961 to 1963. John grew up with 8 siblings, 3 brothers and 5 sisters. He came from a wealthy family and lived in Brookline, Massachusetts. JFK went to Choate, a private school in Massachusetts, and went to Harvard College. This picture is him studying in Harvard, and this picture is him after graduating. After graduating from Harvard, John joined the Navy. One night he was patrolling, and a Japanese destroyer was headed straight towards him. The destroyer split the boat in half, and JFK was slammed hard against the cockpit, once again injuring his weak back. He saved everyone in the boat except for 2, and was awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for leadership and courage. In 1946, John served in Massachusetts' 11th Congressional District. He served 3 times in the House of Representatives, and in 1952 he was elected to the U.S. Senate. In 1960, he decided to run for president as the candidate for the Democratic Party. He asked Lyndon B. Johnson, a senator from Texas, to run with him as his vice president. On January 20th, 1961, he became the 35th President of the United States. During his presidency, JFK met with many civil rights leaders. He was very much against racial segregation and asked Americans over TV to end segregation. JFK was shot on November 22, 1963 by Lee Harvey Oswald.
Who was amazing, totally amazing in my eyes, and probably everybody in the Jewish community in Jackson. He had wonderful ideas on equality and putting forth that program. There were many people who were threatened by it. You had Jim Crow. You had people who were totally separated, and it wasn't separate but equal. You also had people that would do just about anything to keep that the way it was. So they felt their lifestyle was being threatened. So then they were going to push back. So the biggest group would be the KKK, right? So the Jewish community in Jackson, when I was growing up, was led by Rabbi Perry Nussbaum, who was very outspoken in his support of civil rights. And part of our congregation felt, this is great, you have to do this, we know it's right, even though it's scary. The other part was like, wait a minute, this is my life, these are my children, this is my business, it helps me feed my children. I'd rather help a little more quietly. And so there was a split, but what happened was he kept on, and he kept promoting, what he knew to be right. And the temple building was bombed. His house was bombed, and it was all KKK. So the picture I'm trying to paint is of people who have a really hard time with change. And JFK was huge change for a part of the country that didn't want it. So there were all kinds of issues that came up around that. So.
During World War II, Lyndon Baines Johnson was a representative from Texas. In 1942, when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, he was the first member of Congress to support the war effort and join the Navy. He left the Navy after 1944, when every congressperson was forced to return to Washington to discuss the war and be at the State of the Union address from President Roosevelt. LBJ was a member of the Democratic Party, and when he became a senator from Texas, he became the youngest Senate Minority Leader ever. After the assassination of JFK, his body was flown to Washington on Air Force One, where Lyndon Baines Johnson was sworn in as President of the United States of America, next to Jacqueline Kennedy. LBJ was the 36th President of the United States of America. His term in office brought some of the greatest leaping points for civil rights, like the Civil Rights Act, which ended Jim Crow laws, and the Voting Act, which ended poll taxes. As president, one of Lyndon Baines Johnson's main positions was civil rights, and at the time, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a prominent speaker for equal rights and met several times with President Johnson discussing several bills, laws, and acts which would impact the Southern black community. Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, which ended all Jim Crow laws in Southern states that segregated blacks and whites in all manner of life, including places they could live, shop, or work. The act also created an Equal Opportunity Commission, which allowed African Americans to be in and or start labor unions. Also, the commission allowed black people to sue if any rights given by this act were abused or broken. The Voting Rights Act, which was passed by the government in 1965, ended unfair illiteracy tests that even college graduates could not pass. Poll taxes, which were charges on blacks to vote, were ended, and discrimination against people in the voting booth, only for their race, religion, or pigmentation, was outlawed. When Vietnam erupted in a civil war between the Communists in the North and the Democratic government in the South, the U.S. sent a large army to aid the South. President Johnson wanted all people, whether Jewish, Catholic, black, or white, to be able to be drafted into desegregated divisions and to fight for democracy. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott exchanged vows on June 18, 1953. Yolanda Denise, born on November 17, 1955, was the firstborn child of Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King. She was a human rights activist and an actress. Yolanda was active in many projects that honored her father. Dexter Scott King was born on January 30, 1961. Dexter followed in the footsteps of MLK Jr. He attended Morehouse College. After MLK's death, Coretta Scott King went forward and kept her husband's message alive through her social rights activism that continued throughout her life. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. got his first book published on September 15, 1929. His book is a collection of Dr. King's most requested sermons. This collection includes the text of Dr. King's best-known orations, I Have a Dream, his acceptance speech for the Nobel Peace Prize, and Beyond Vietnam, a compelling argument for ending the ongoing conflict. Each speech has an insightful introduction on the current relevance of Dr. King's words.
In 1954, Martin Luther King Jr. became pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. Martin Luther King Jr. graduated from Booker T. Washington High School. He was 15 years old and was admitted to Morehouse College. King became a minister in his father's church, Ebenezer Baptist Church. A crowd gathers to listen to a speech given by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. during the Selma to Montgomery Civil Rights March on March 25, 1965, in Montgomery, Alabama. Many people came to see Martin Luther King Jr. speak.
I Have a Dream is a well-known public speech delivered by Martin Luther King Jr. during the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom on August 28, 1963, in which he calls for an end to racism in the United States and called for civil and economic rights. Delivered to over 250,000 civil rights supporters from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., the speech was a defining moment of the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4, 1968. Just after 6 p.m., King was standing on the second-floor balcony of the Lorraine Motel, where he and his associates were staying. King was shot in the neck by James Earl Ray. He was rushed to a hospital, where he was pronounced dead about an hour later, at the age of 39.
So Martin Luther King did have an effect on my life because what he was fighting for was equality for a whole group of people. And as a person living in the South, a Jewish person living in the South, I could certainly understand the struggle for people to have an equal footing in life. So I would say that it was an uphill struggle for many people around me. I mean, I wasn't out doing in the marches or really carrying the banner outwardly, but it certainly set a goal, for my life, for what life should be like for other people.